Tonight, we journey back, far back, to the banks of the Nile, where the sun rose each day over fields of gold, and the lives of kings and queens were bound to the rhythm of an ancient river. You will walk the palace halls, hear the quiet steps of servants in the early dawn, and watch the long, deliberate rituals that carried a ruler from birth to the grave and beyond. The stories you'll hear tonight are not of grand battles or blazing triumphs. They are of the slow, careful moments, the endless details that shaped a life and a death in the kingdom of the Pharaohs. So find your place, let your body rest, and let the weight of the day fall away. The desert night is still, the stars are bright over the Nile, and history is waiting to whisper to you in the dark. Born to rule, trained to serve the gods, you are standing in the quiet courtyard of an ancient Egyptian palace. The air warm, but still, carrying the faint smell of lotus blossoms drifting in from the garden pools. Beyond the high mud brick walls, the Nile glitters in the morning light. But inside these guarded grounds, life moves in hushed, deliberate patterns. Somewhere in the shaded colonnade, a boy of perhaps 6 years old is being taught how to walk. Not simply to walk, but to walk. As a king from the moment of birth, he was an heir, a Nesabit in waiting, and his body, his gestures, his voice were all considered the property of the gods. Even in infancy, he was treated with ceremonial care. Wet nurses were chosen not just for health, but for purity. Their families investigated for generations to ensure no impurity of bloodline or scandal. The child's earliest toys were not random. They were miniature versions of ritual objects meant to familiarize him with the tools of kingship before he could read or write. The isolation of royal youth life for a young heir was one of separation. He did not play freely among village children. His companions were chosen for their family's loyalty and political usefulness. Even these playmates were instructed to address him with titles, never by a simple personal name. While other children might run barefoot in the mud during the Nile's flood season, the prince's feet were kept in sandals, his skin shielded from the harsh sun by attendants holding ostrich feather fans. Every bruise, every scratch was a concern, not because of physical pain, but because his body was considered a reflection of Egypt's divine order. The isolation extended beyond the physical. The boy learned early that his words carried weight. A casual complaint could be taken as an omen. A clumsy remark could offend a courtier or be whispered into the ear of a priest. In a world where gossip could erode the stability of a reign before it even began, the royal child learned silence and careful speech far earlier than most adults. Lessons for a future. God education for a future pharaoh was rigorous but oddly narrow. The young heir was instructed in reading and writing hieroglyphs, though. In practice, many kings preferred to dictate to scribes rather than write themselves. He memorized long hymns to the gods, recited the names of his royal ancestors, and studied the myths that framed Egypt's history as the will of the divine. Military instruction began early, though rarely involved actual combat. Wooden bows, small chariots, and spear drills were part of daily training. Yet this was less about preparing for the battlefield and more about embodying the image of a warrior king. Actual warfare, when it came, was largely directed by generals and advisors. The most important lessons, however, were ceremonial. The prince was taught how to stand before the gods in a temple, how to hold an offering bowl, and how to wear the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt without allowing them to slip or tilt, a detail that in the eyes of the court could signal divine displeasure. The weight of expectation, even as a child. The heir was burdened with the knowledge that he was not living for himself. His health, behavior, and even his moods were considered reflections of Egypt's fortunes. A sudden illness could be taken as a warning from the gods. A period of restlessness might prompt priests to perform purification rituals, fearing that divine order, Matt, was at risk. This pressure intensified as the boy grew. By adolescence, he was expected to appear at certain public ceremonies, often standing for hours in heavy ceremonial attire under the burning sun. Each appearance was a test to show endurance, composure, and divine favor. A childhood that wasn't one. The irony was that the royal child, surrounded by luxury and attendance, was denied the freedoms enjoyed by common children. He could not wander the streets, eat food from a market stall, or swim in the Nile without a ritual blessing. His games were staged under watchful eyes. His friendships were politically calculated. The laughter of ordinary childhood was replaced by the measured voice of priests and tutors at night. When the palace halls quieted and the oil lamps flickered low, perhaps the young heir lay awake, listening to the distant croak of frogs by the river. Did he imagine running barefoot through the reeds, chasing fireflies like the children he'd never meet? Or was his mind already occupied with the weight of the double crown, a destiny pressed upon him before he could choose his own path? The boy's world was one of privilege, yes, but also of confinement, expectation, and constant preparation for a role that would demand his entire life. And so you have to wonder, was this grooming for kingship a blessing of birth, or the first step into a lifelong cage? The palace where a royal heir grew up was far more than a home. It was a living institution, a combination of court, temple, and training ground for the gods' chosen ruler. Every hall, courtyard, and garden served a purpose in shaping the boy into a pharaoh. A palace built for instruction, the layout of a royal residence was deliberate. Public reception halls were vast, with high ceilings and painted columns designed to dwarf the human figure, reminding all who entered of the majesty of the throne. The prince learned to walk these spaces slowly and deliberately, never rushing, always aware of the symbolic weight of his steps. Private quarters were more modest, but still ceremonial. Walls were adorned with images of the gods, reminding the heir that even his moments of rest occurred under divine watch. Servants and attendants moved silently, providing food, clothing, and bathwater, yet never breaking the unspoken rule. The heir's life was a ritual in progress. The tutors and their lessons. Young heir's education was entrusted to a carefully chosen circle. Priestly tutors taught him the sacred stories, temple protocols, and the correct pronunciation of ancient hymns. These lessons were often recited in dimly lit rooms, scented with incense, where the boy repeated each phrase until his voice matched the slow, deliberate cadence of the priests. Military instructors oversaw training in archery, chariot handling, and symbolic hunting expeditions. Killing wild animals, especially lions or hippopotamuses, was a royal display of strength and divine protection over Egypt, though in many cases the wild animals were captured and released for the hunt. Vizier's assistants introduced him to the basics of governance, how to read tax records, understand agricultural reports, and issue decrees in the proper formal style. These lessons were less glamorous but essential. The pharaoh was expected to appear as the final authority on all matters, even if he relied on officials to execute his decisions. Discipline was constant. A mistake in reciting an offering prayer might result in hours of repetition. A failure to hold a ceremonial posture could mean practicing with a weighted crown until his neck ached. Language and secrecy. The prince learned not just the language of the people, Middle Egyptian, but also the formal, older forms used in religious and legal contexts. This was a kind of linguistic mask. In daily life, he might speak plainly to attendants, but in public ceremony, his words became a carefully curated performance. Alongside this, he was taught the art of measured speech. A pharaoh could not be seen as indecisive, nor could he speak in haste. Even as a teenager, the heir might pause for long moments before answering a question, letting the silence itself convey authority. Secrets were another lesson. The workings of the palace, the tensions between priests and administrators, the real state of Egypt's treasury. These were matters kept behind closed doors. A slip of the tongue to the wrong ear could stir unrest. From an early age, the boy learned to keep thoughts and knowledge locked away. Symbolic play and practiced divinity. Even leisure was not truly leisure. Games like Senet, the ancient board game, were more than pastimes. They symbolized the journey of the soul through the afterlife. Hunting trips doubled as royal propaganda, their results displayed in temple reliefs long before the prince wore. The crown festivals provided variety, but they, too, were instructive. During processions, the heir might stand beside his father, the reigning pharaoh, holding ritual objects. These appearances were training in endurance and presentation. Hours under the desert sun taught the prince how to hide discomfort, how to maintain a serene expression, even as his feet ached and sweat trickled down his back. The father, as a living example for the reigning pharaoh, served as the most important model. The boy observed how his father addressed priests, listened to petitions, and greeted foreign envoys. In public, the king was flawless, godlike, patient, decisive. In private, he might be weary, sharp-tempered, or burdened with decisions. But even then, the heir was learning the art of concealing human frailty behind an unshakable facade. These lessons were not optional. They were absorbed daily, like the Nile's flood soaking into the land, gradually but completely. By the time the heir reached his late teens, there was little of the unguarded child left. The palace, with its endless rituals, formal lessons, and silent corridors, had succeeded in its task, transforming a boy into a figure who belonged not to himself, but to Egypt and the gods. Yet a question remained: if the heir had been shaped entirely for the role of pharaoh, could he ever truly know who he was without the crown? The day a prince became pharaoh was rarely a single, clean event. It might follow the death of his father after a long illness, or the sudden shock of an unexpected passing. Sometimes the heir knew for years that the throne would soon be his. Other times, the transition was abrupt, leaving little space to process the change. But regardless of the circumstances, the moment was not one of personal joy. It was the assumption of a role that had been rehearsed since his first breath. the funeral before the coronation. The death of a reigning pharaoh meant immediate action. The royal body had to be prepared for mummification within hours to begin the 70-day process of embalming. Priests, embalmers, and officials moved swiftly, while the heir stepped into a ceremonial role almost immediately in public. He was now the ruler. In private, he might still be a son in mourning, but even grief was shaped by protocol. The prince would appear in temples to offer prayers for the departed king's safe passage into the afterlife. His own feelings were secondary to the image of continuity. Egypt could not be seen as leaderless, even for a single day. The coronation rituals, the transition to Pharaoh, was formalized through an intricate series of ceremonies, often lasting several days. Crowning in Upper and Lower Egypt, the new ruler traveled to both regions, donning the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt before finally wearing the combined double crown, receiving the royal names. Every pharaoh took on 5 official names, each tied to divine authority. These were proclaimed before the gods and the people, sealing the heir's identity as the earthly embodiment of Horus. Presentation to the gods. The king entered the most sacred parts of temples, spaces forbidden to ordinary people, to stand before the statues of the gods, offering gifts and reciting prayers that declared his role as their chosen intermediary. The ceremonies were as much for the people as for the king himself. They reassured Egypt that divine order had not been broken by the death of one ruler, but seamlessly carried on through another. The illusion of freedom. As if the prince had ever entertained the thought that becoming pharaoh would bring him more independence. The reality was sobering. His life, already tightly controlled, became almost entirely consumed by duty. Every public appearance carried meaning. Every private conversation could shape political alliances. The courtiers, who had once been his father's advisors, were now his, but their loyalty might not be absolute. Priests guarded the temples, viziers managed the bureaucracy, generals oversaw the army. The pharaoh was expected to command all, yet each group had its own interests, and navigating them required constant care. The double life of a living god to the people. The new pharaoh was flawless, unaging, wise, divinely protected. To himself, he was a man in his 20s or 30s, still learning the weight of decisions that could affect thousands. The image of godhood had to be maintained at all costs. A stumble in a public festival might be taken as a sign of weakness. A poor harvest could be blamed on his supposed loss of divine favor. In quiet moments, perhaps he remembered the boy he once was, walking the palace gardens under the watchful eyes of attendants. But those memories could not guide him now. The role was no longer something he was preparing for. It was his life. Every hour, every breath, from training to burden, the decades of preparation had succeeded. The boy who had been molded, polished, and instructed was now the ruler of Egypt, the guardian of Ma'at, the link between mortals and gods. But that training came at a cost. His identity had been replaced by a crown, his choices limited by tradition, his life no longer his own. From here on, the young man would not be judged as a son or a friend, but as the living god of Egypt. And in that role, failure was not an option. The prince had been born to rule, trained to serve the gods, and finally crowned to uphold a divine order that had existed for centuries. But one question would follow him through his reign. In serving the gods so completely, had he ever truly served himself? By the time a pharaoh had ruled for several decades, the rhythm of his life was no longer measured in years or seasons, but in cycles of ceremonies. The line between religious obligation and political necessity had blurred entirely. Every offering to the gods doubled as an offering to public perception, and every public appearance reinforced the same truth. The king's role was never his own. The mourning that lasted a lifetime, a typical day for the pharaoh, began long before the rest of the court stirred. Attendants entered his chambers in silence, carrying linen garments freshly washed in the Nile, scented with incense. A priest would arrive to perform the purification rites, splashing cool water on his hands, anointing him with oils, and reciting blessings to cleanse his body and spirit before he faced the gods. What followed was not a leisurely audience with advisors or a walk in the gardens, but a direct procession to the temple. And there, in the dim light, filtered through stone colonnades, the day's rituals began. The statue of the god was awakened, offered food and drink, clothed in fine linen, and honored with incense. It was all symbolic. The statue did not eat or drink, but the act itself was considered vital to sustaining the divine presence in Egypt. When these morning rites were complete, the pharaoh might briefly return to the palace, but free time was a relative term. More often than not, another ceremony or festival appearance awaited. The burden of festivals in old age, as a king aged, the demands of these rituals became heavier. The crowns seemed heavier on the neck, the heat of the sun less bearable. Yet, the illusion of divine vigor had to be maintained at all costs during the said festivals. Attendants could subtly aid him during the ritual run, standing just close enough to catch him if he stumbled. In public processions, richly decorated parasols shielded him from the sun, not as a comfort, but as a calculated preservation of the image of strength. If he could not attend in person, the rituals went on without him, but never without explanation. Priests would present it as a matter of divine will, perhaps claiming that God had instructed the pharaoh to remain in meditation or to focus on a sacred task. Even in absence, the image of control had to be preserved. Temples as watchtowers. The temples were not merely places of worship, they were centers of surveillance. Priests, ever present, observed the pharaoh's behavior, health, and mood. Reports spread quickly through the priesthood and into the ears of the elite. A moment of weakness, a misstep, a cough, a mispronounced prayer could be whispered about for weeks, sometimes even recorded in temple archives. These watchful eyes ensured the king upheld the rituals with precision, but they also kept him bound to them. After all, if the priests were the ones who carried the gods' voices to the people, the pharaoh could not risk losing their support. The final ceremony for all the countless offerings, chants, and processions. One ceremony was inevitable, the king's own funeral rites. The irony was unavoidable. The same religious system that had demanded his presence every day of his life would, in his death, claim his body entirely. The embalming process, the construction of the tomb, the recitation of prayers, all followed the same pattern he had performed for others. In the eyes of Egypt, this was not an end, but a transition. The pharaoh had upheld Mat in life. Now he would continue in the afterlife. But in that moment, the chain of ceremonies shifted to the next ruler, and the cycle began anew. The rituals had preserved Egypt for millennia, but they had also preserved a truth far less divine. The pharaoh's life belonged to the calendar, to the priests, and to the gods, and once the crown was placed upon his head, there was never truly a day without ceremony. And you might wonder, did the rituals keep Egypt alive? Or did Egypt keep the rituals alive at the expense of its kings? The heart of Egypt's power lay not only in the walls of its palaces, but in the echoing courts of its temples. For the pharaoh, the temple was both stage and cage, a place where his image as the divine ruler was maintained through a never-ending cycle of offerings, blessings, and symbolic acts. The temple, as a second palace, the great temples of Karnak, Luxor, and Abu Simbel, were more than places of worship. They were administrative centers, treasuries, and political tools. Their columns, carved with scenes of the pharaoh embracing the gods, told a public story. The king was the chosen one, beloved of the divine, guarantor of the Nile's bounty. But these temples also dictated his movements. A major festival might require him to travel hundreds of miles, enduring the slow passage of the royal barge, stopping at key sites to perform carefully rehearsed rites within the inner sanctuaries. Spaces so sacred that only the high priest and the king could enter. The rituals became even more precise. Offerings had to be placed in a particular order. Chants had to follow an unchanging melody. The smallest error could be seen as an insult to the gods, one that might, in the eyes of the people, invite drought or disaster. The burden of the said festival of all the rituals, none was more physically and politically demanding than the said festival. Held after 30 years of rule, it was meant to renew the pharaoh's strength, but it was also a public test. The central act was the ritual run, where the king dashed between boundary markers representing Upper and Lower Egypt. Though symbolic, it was still a physical challenge, especially for an aging ruler. Assistants might be discreetly positioned to support him, and the course could be shortened without anyone openly acknowledging it. Following this, the king appeared in different crowns and regalia, each change representing his mastery over various aspects of Egypt. The crowds saw a god-king, but behind the scenes, attendants adjusted heavy robes, wiped sweat from his brow, and ensured the crowns stayed straight, all while keeping the image of divine vigor intact. Every gesture as propaganda in the eyes of the people, the pharaohs. Participation in these rituals was proof that Egypt's cosmic balance remained unbroken. If the king was strong, the Nile would flood, the harvest would be plentiful, and the gods would remain content. Thus, every action, from the way he poured a libation to the manner in which he lifted a scepter, was loaded with meaning. The ceremonies were performances in the truest sense, each movement choreographed, each word rehearsed, and like any performance, they left little room for spontaneity. The political impact was enormous. The pharaoh's presence at a festival could reinforce loyalty among regional governors, intimidate potential rivals, and reassure the population during uncertain times. But it also tied the ruler's authority directly to his ability to appear in public, looking every bit the divine king. The toll on the king over time, the weight of these obligations could become suffocating. Even minor illness might disrupt. A ritual, forcing priests to step in and act on the king's behalf, a delicate substitution that had to be explained to the public without sparking rumors of weakness. And there were always more ceremonies on the horizon. The lunar calendar, the agricultural seasons, and the cycles of the gods created a schedule that was unending. While the pharaoh's courtiers and generals might enjoy days of leisure between duties, the king himself rarely had such a luxury. The rituals gave the pharaoh his divine image and cemented his place in the minds of his people, but they also consumed his life, leaving little space for anything beyond the maintenance of mat. And so a question lingers: was the pharaoh performing these ceremonies for the gods, or had the ceremonies been designed to keep the king himself forever under their control? Do you want me to move on to section 3 of story 2, chains of ceremony and the weight of ritual? You said next. ChatGPT said, all right, here's story 2, section 3, for chains of ceremony and the weight of ritual. Story 2, chains of ceremony and the weight of ritual, section 3. When the rituals never end, by the time a pharaoh had ruled for several decades, the rhythm of his life was no longer measured in years or seasons, but in cycles of ceremonies. The line between religious obligation and political necessity had blurred entirely. Every offering to the gods doubled as an offering to public perception, and every public appearance reinforced the same truth: the king's role was never his own. The mourning that lasted a lifetime, a typical day for the pharaoh, began long before the rest of the court stirred. Attendants entered his chambers in silence, carrying linen garments freshly washed in the Nile, scented with incense. A priest would arrive to perform the purification rites, splashing cool water on his hands, anointing him with oils, and reciting blessings to cleanse his body and spirit before he faced the gods. What followed was not a leisurely audience with advisors or a walk in the gardens, but a direct procession to the temple. And there, in the dim light filtered through stone colonnades, the day's rituals began. The statue of the god was awakened, offered food and drink, clothed in fine linen, and honored with incense. It was all symbolic. The statue did not eat or drink, but the act itself was considered vital to sustaining the divine presence in Egypt. When these morning rites were complete, the pharaoh might briefly return to the palace, but free time was a relative term. More often than not, another ceremony or festival appearance awaited. The burden of festivals in old age. As a king aged, the demands of these rituals became heavier. The crowns seemed heavier on the neck, the heat of the sun less bearable. Yet, the illusion of divine vigor had to be maintained at all costs. During the said festivals, attendants could subtly aid him during the ritual run, standing just close enough to catch him if he stumbled. In public processions, richly decorated parasols shielded him from the sun, not as a comfort, but as a calculated preservation of the image of strength. If he could not attend in person, the rituals went on without him, but never without explanation. Priests would present it as a matter of divine will, perhaps claiming that God had instructed the pharaoh to remain in meditation or to focus on a sacred task. Even in absence, the image of control had to be preserved. Story 2. Chains of ceremony and the weight of ritual. You rise before dawn. The air still heavy with the cool dampness of the Nile's night mist. The palace is already stirring. Servants move through the halls in soft sandals, carrying polished vessels of water, trays of bread, and bundles of linen robes. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, the first call of waterfowl echoes across the river. For most Egyptians, the day begins with the work of the fields. But for the pharaoh, the morning begins with the work of the gods. The life of a ruler in ancient Egypt was not only about issuing decrees and leading armies. It was a tightly woven schedule of religious obligations, ceremonies that were considered essential for maintaining the balance of the world. In this belief system, the sun rose because the gods were satisfied. The Nile flooded because Ordermat was upheld, and Egypt prospered because the pharaoh carried out the rituals exactly as prescribed. Skipping a ceremony was not simply poor form, it was unthinkable. To neglect the gods' demands was to risk famine, flood, or plague. And so, day after day, year after year, the ruler moved through an exhausting cycle of sacred duties. The daily temple duties. Every morning, the pharaoh was expected to be present physically or symbolically in the most sacred inner rooms of Egypt's great temples. The opening of the mouth ceremony, often performed for statues of the gods, was a daily reaffirmation that the divine was awake, fed, and honored. The process was slow and deliberate. Purification, the pharaoh bathed and dressed in freshly laundered linen, abstaining from certain foods and perfumes that might offend the gods. Offering trays of bread, meat, beer, and fruit were presented, each item blessed and placed before the deity's image. Incantations, the ruler, or a high priest standing in his stead, recited ancient hymns in a steady, rhythmic tone, each syllable unchanged for centuries, even if the king was far from the capital, traveling for war or inspection. These rites had to be carried out by representatives. The gods' attention could not be left unattended, even for a day. The weight of the yearly festivals, beyond the daily rituals, were the great festivals, sprawling, multi-day events that required the pharaoh's personal involvement. These were as much acts of statecraft as of faith, uniting the people under a shared spectacle of divine order. Some, like the Feast of Opet, celebrated the bond between the pharaoh and the god Amen, involving elaborate processions from Karnak to Luxor, with statues carried on gilded barges down the Nile. The pharaoh was both participant and centerpiece, his presence reinforcing the belief that the gods favored his reign. The said festival was the most demanding, celebrated after 30 years of rule, and every 3 years thereafter. It was meant to renew the pharaoh's vitality. It involved public running, symbolic hunts, and the wearing of different crowns to show mastery over Upper and Lower Egypt. Even in advanced age, the ruler was expected to perform these feats, often with the assistance of carefully staged conditions to ensure he appeared vigorous before the people. Ceremony as a political tool, these events were not simply for divine favor. They were demonstrations of power. Every procession, every temple visit was an opportunity to remind the population that the pharaoh stood between them and chaos. His image was carved into temple walls, showing him offering gifts to the gods, striking down enemies, or performing sacred rites. But these displays came with a cost. The planning and execution of festivals consumed immense resources: grain for the masses, gold for offerings, labor for decorations, and barges. The ruler himself was bound to these events as tightly as any servant. If illness, injury, or even weather interfered, Adjustments had to be made without giving the impression of weakness or divine disfavor. The endless cycle, this ceremonial schedule, was relentless. The year was divided by festival dates, planting seasons, and astronomical observations that dictated when certain gods should be honored. Even private moments were rare, as temple duties could interrupt meals, meetings, or rest. It was a kind of cage made of tradition. While the pharaoh's power seemed absolute in matters of state, in matters of ritual, he was as bound as any priest, perhaps more so, for he embodied the very order these rituals preserved. As the sun climbed over the horizon, and the first rituals of the day came to an end, the pharaoh might return to the palace briefly before the next duty called. The day was far from over, and the calendar of the divine never waited for a king's convenience. So you have to wonder, did the gods demand these rituals for Egypt's sake, or to keep its ruler forever in service? Power in ancient Egypt was never absolute, no matter how often monuments proclaimed it to be so. Behind the granite statues, the carefully carved hieroglyphs, and the grand temple processions lay a truth both subtle and unsettling. The throne itself could be as fragile as papyrus in the flood. The illusion of immortality, every pharaoh was expected to present himself as the living embodiment of Horus, eternal and unchanging. Publicly, this image was maintained at all costs. But the reality of governance meant endless negotiation, compromise, and quiet concessions, all of which had to remain invisible to the people. An edict might be proclaimed in the morning and quietly amended by evening after a discussion with the vizier. A royal marriage might be arranged not for love or even alliance, but simply to keep the priesthood from backing a rival heir. These decisions rarely appeared in inscriptions, but they determined the survival of a reign. The dangerous game of succession, the greatest political crises in Egypt, often came not during a reign, but at its end. A pharaoh's death was both a moment of mourning and an opportunity for factions to advance their candidates. If the heir was young or untested, the vizier might step in as regent, a position of both service and immense temptation. Some regents faithfully guarded the throne until the heir came of age. Others subtly reshaped the court to keep power for themselves. There were even times when the army or priesthood backed entirely different claimants, plunging the court into quiet or not so quiet conflict. Whispers and rivalries. Palace life was full of whispers, rumors of an official hoarding wealth, suspicions of priests manipulating omens, or mutterings about a general's growing influence. Few of these whispers were entirely false. Fewer still were entirely true. For a pharaoh, the danger was not merely in believing or ignoring these rumors, but in acting on them without proof. Removing a powerful official without clear cause could create new enemies faster than it removed old ones. When the throne falters, history remembers certain pharaohs as weak, not because they lacked armies or wealth, but because they lost control of the networks around them. One might imagine a ruler seated upon a golden throne, but the legs of that throne, the priests, the scribes, the military, and the bureaucracy, could be slowly sawed away. A pharaoh might continue to rule in name, even as real decisions were made elsewhere. The quiet survivors, yet many rulers navigated these treacherous waters successfully, reigning for decades despite the constant pressures. Their survival depended on patience, the careful distribution of favor, and the ability to sense when a confrontation would cost more than it was worth. Sometimes, the greatest victory for a pharaoh was not in building the tallest obelisk or winning a distant battle, but in keeping the delicate web of politics intact, day after day, year after year. You might picture it now, the golden mask, the steady gaze, the calm voice addressing the court. Behind it, an unending calculation, every nod and pause chosen with care. And you might wonder, in such a world of constant balance and hidden power, did the pharaoh ever truly rule? Or was he merely the most visible piece in a game played by many unseen hands? When you picture the governance of ancient Egypt, you might imagine a series of clear chains of command, the pharaoh at the top, the vizier beneath him, then a hierarchy of officials, scribes, and overseers. But like the Nile's currents, much of Egypt's political flow was invisible to the eye. The visible order was only the surface. The deeper currents were where the real decisions often took shape. The bureaucratic Bakban Egypt's administration was astonishingly complex for its time. Records were everything: a tax unpaid, a shipment delayed, or a construction project miscalculated could set off ripples across the kingdom. Scribes documented every transaction, and their records became the foundation of royal policy. But scribes were not merely passive record keepers. In a system where the ability to read and write was rare, they controlled access to information. A scribe could subtly alter a record, lose a document, or add an extra line to an order that shifted its meaning. While pharaohs and viziers made grand pronouncements, it was often the scribes who determined how, or even if, those pronouncements were carried out. The web of overseers managed everything from agricultural estates to quarrying expeditions. The overseer of the granaries, for instance, could control food distribution during times of scarcity, a position that could make or break loyalty among both the people and the army. These overseers answered to the vizier, but they often had their own local networks of loyalty. In times of instability, an overseer could quietly redirect resources, strengthen ties with the priesthood, or even delay tax shipments to pressure the palace into concessions. Temples as economic powers. The temples of Egypt were not simply places of prayer. They were landowners, employers, and treasuries in their own right. At certain points in history, the temples collectively owned more wealth than the royal court. Priests oversaw vast storehouses of grain, gold, incense, and livestock. They managed workshops producing luxury goods, and they financed expeditions for rare minerals. When the pharaoh and the priesthood worked in harmony, this wealth became a tool of state power. When they were at odds, it could become a weapon against the throne. The military as a political actor. While Egypt's military was loyal to the pharaoh, in theory, loyalty often flowed to whoever paid the soldiers and ensured their supplies. Generals who commanded large forces were natural political players. Some pharaohs sought to keep the army divided into smaller units to prevent any single general from becoming too powerful. Others tried to ensure that generals' fortunes were tied directly to royal favor, granting them land or privileges that could be revoked at a hint of disloyalty. But when times grew uncertain, a bad harvest, a border war, or a contested succession, the army's loyalty could shift. A respected general might suddenly hold the fate of the throne in his hands. The palace, as a court of favors, daily life at court was a constant dance of favors, promises, and alliances. Minor officials might spend months currying favor for a single audience with the king. Merchants would offer rare goods in hopes of gaining royal contracts. Nobles would sponsor feasts to celebrate royal occasions, expecting political rewards in return. The pharaoh had to navigate this landscape without appearing too indebted to any single faction. Too much favor shown to the military could alienate the priests. Too much wealth granted to temples could leave the army underfunded. Every decision was a balancing act. In truth, Egypt's government was less a pyramid and more a network, a shifting mesh of relationships, obligations, and rivalries. And it leads to a quiet but unsettling thought. If so many others held the strings of influence, what truly separated a strong pharaoh from a weak one? Story 3. The politics behind the throne. You might imagine the pharaoh as a solitary figure of command, issuing orders from a golden throne, his word instantly shaping the destiny of the land. That is how the monuments present him, the lone ruler, unchallenged, his will indistinguishable from the will of the gods. But reality, like the desert sands, was layered. Beneath the surface of this carefully polished image, there was a far more tangled web, a quiet, persistent tug-of-war for influence. The silent partners in Rule King's first and most constant companion in governance was not his queen, but his vizier. This chief minister was the linchpin of Egypt's administration, overseeing taxation, justice, public works, and temple management. Officially, the vizier was the pharaoh's servant, carrying out his commands without question. In practice, the vizier could shape those commands before they were ever spoken. The vizier decided which petitions reached the king, which disputes were presented for judgment, and which crises demanded immediate attention. A well-placed delay, a careful omission, or a rephrased request could subtly steer the direction of Egypt's policy without the king ever suspecting, or at least without him publicly acknowledging the manipulation. The priestly power. If the vizier controlled the machinery of the state, the priests controlled its soul. Egypt's temples were not only houses of worship, they were immense economic engines, owning farmland, herds, workshops, and ships. The chief priests of major temples could rival the court in wealth and resources, and because their authority came from the gods, it was harder to challenge openly. A pharaoh who angered the priesthood risked more than divine disfavor. The priests could subtly influence public opinion by emphasizing certain omens, interpreting dreams in politically convenient ways, or discovering prophecies that happened to support or undermine a king's decisions. The royal family as rivals within the palace walls. The pharaoh's authority was not absolute. Brothers, cousins, and uncles often held high-ranking military or administrative posts. A family member who was too popular with the army or too respected by the people could easily become a potential threat. Some pharaohs dealt with this by granting such relatives comfortable but harmless titles, keeping them close under watch. Others resorted to more brutal measures, exile, imprisonment, or quiet execution, when a rival's ambition grew too dangerous. The foreign factor. Egypt was not isolated from the rest of the ancient world. Foreign diplomats, traders, and envoys brought not only goods, but also influence. Alliances were cemented through marriage, and foreign queens or consorts sometimes acted as unexpected political players. A foreign-born queen could introduce new customs into the court, win over factions with exotic gifts, and shape the pharaoh's perspective on trade and war. In this way, Egypt's politics were not contained within the Nile Valley. They rippled outward, influenced by the ambitions of distant kings and the shifting balance of power beyond its borders. The thin line between symbol and sovereign, the greatest challenge for any pharaoh, was balancing his symbolic role as the divine embodiment of Maat with the practical necessity of political compromise. Too much compromise, and the image of absolute authority cracked. Too little, and the machinery of state might grind to a halt under the resistance of its many hidden operators. The official reliefs showed the pharaoh smiting enemies and commanding order, but behind closed doors he might be negotiating with a stubborn vizier, conceding to a temple's demands, or quietly reshuffling his court to neutralize an ambitious general. In public, the pharaoh's word was law. In private, it was often just one voice among many, albeit the loudest and most dangerous. And so the question lingers: was the pharaoh truly Egypt's ruler, or was he its most visible servant? The day of death, when the pharaoh finally passed away, whether after decades of rule or in the sudden stillness of illness, the palace would descend into a carefully rehearsed ritual. Officials moved swiftly. Royal physicians confirmed death, and attendants immediately began the work of preserving the body before the heat of Egypt could set in. This was not a moment for public display of grief. In the eyes of the state, the pharaoh was a god, and gods did not die, they transformed. The process had to be orderly, deliberate, and sacred. The house of purification, the first stage, took place in a structure near the Nile, called the Wabit, the house of purification. Here, embalmers washed the king's body in sacred waters drawn from the river. This was not just cleaning, it was a symbolic act of returning the flesh to the waters of creation, ready to be remade. Priests wearing jackal masks of Anubis oversaw the process, chanting spells to guard the soul from malevolent forces. Mummification, a craft of eternity. Over 70 days, the body was transformed into a vessel that could endure eternity. The process began with removing the internal organs, each placed in its own canopic jar, guarded by the 4 sons of Horus. The heart, however, was often left in place or carefully wrapped, for it would be weighed against the feather of Maat in the afterlife. The body cavity was cleansed with aromatic resins, then packed with linen and natron salt to draw out every drop of moisture. Slowly, over weeks, the flesh tightened and dried, halting the decay that claimed ordinary mortals. Wrapping the king once fully dried, the pharaoh's body was anointed with oils and resins. Skilled embalmers began the wrapping. Hundreds of yards of fine linen, layer after layer. Between the layers, amulets were placed, a scarab over the heart, a jed pillar along the spine, a wajet eye for protection. Each wrapping was accompanied by ritual words, as though weaving a magical cocoon. By the end, the king's form was hidden beneath gleaming linen, smelling faintly of resin and myrrh. The final procession, when all was ready. The mummy was placed within its nested coffins, and the great procession began. Priests, officials, and mourners moved through the necropolis, carrying the king to his eternal home. One of the most sacred moments came at the tomb's entrance. the opening of the mouth ceremony. Here, priests touched special tools to the mummy's mouth and eyes, symbolically restoring the senses so the king could eat, speak, and see in the next world. Sealing the tomb inside the tomb, the sarcophagus was lowered into place. Offerings filled the side chambers, jars of wine, baskets of bread, weapons, perfumes, and chests of clothing. The air smelled of incense and stone dust. When all was set, the workers backed out, and the tomb's entrance was sealed with heavy blocks. No one, in theory, would ever enter again. In the darkness, the pharaoh now rested, surrounded by gold, stone, and silence. Legacy in stone and silence for all the care, time, and wealth poured into these preparations. The truth was grim. Many tombs were robbed within years or even months of sealing. Others were lost to shifting sands, their treasures buried and forgotten. Yet the belief endured that through these rites the pharaoh could live forever. And in some ways, it was true. Thousands of years later, we still speak of them, stand before their statues, and read the names they carved into stone. The ancient Egyptians prepared for eternity with more precision and devotion than perhaps any other civilization, but eternity, as they imagined it, was never certain, and even the mightiest kings could only hope their journey would be undisturbed. With the sealing of the tomb, the life of a pharaoh ended, yet the story of Egypt's kings continued, shaped by the sand, the Nile, and the belief that even death was not the end. The tomb itself was only the stage. What truly filled it, the objects, offerings, and carefully prepared furnishings, made it a home fit for a king in the afterlife. In ancient Egyptian belief, the soul would need every comfort it had enjoyed. In life, food, drink, clothing, tools, and symbols of power. Without them, the journey into eternity could be a barren, hungry one. The royal shopping list from the earliest days of a pharaoh's reign. Scribes began compiling a list of everything the ruler might need in the afterlife. This was not a modest undertaking. The inventory included fine linen for dressing, ornate furniture for lounging, games for leisure, weapons for protection, and vessels for food and drink. The sheer scale of this preparation was staggering. Craftsmen worked for decades, carving cedar beds imported from Lebanon, inlaying chairs with ivory, and hammering gold into delicate patterns. The king's personal taste was reflected in the items of fondness for a particular game board, a certain style of goblets, or the head of a favorite deity carved on every chest. Food for the dead to ensure the pharaoh would never go hungry. Storerooms of food offerings were prepared, baskets of dried dates, amphorae of beer, sealed jars of honey, and loaves of bread, shaped like the rising sun, were all set aside. But food in the tomb was more than physical sustenance. Painted scenes on the walls served as magical duplicates. If the real offerings decayed over time, the painted loaves, steaming ducks, and overflowing baskets of fruit would become real again in the afterlife through the magic of representation. Guardians of gold. No tomb was complete without protective figures. Amulets of every shape, the ankh for life, the jed pillar for stability, the scarab for rebirth, were tucked into linen wrappings, placed in jewelry boxes, or hung from statues. Even more imposing were the guardian statues stationed at doorways, tall, black-painted sentinels with gold accents, standing ready with spears or staffs. These figures were not merely symbolic. They were believed to come alive in the afterlife to protect their king from harm. The sarcophagus, and often at the heart of the tomb, was the sarcophagus, a massive stone container carved from granite, quartzite, or limestone. Within it, a nested series of coffins cradled the mummy. Each coffin was a masterpiece of artistry: gilded surfaces, inlaid stones, and painted faces that echoed the ruler's features in an idealized form. These layers were not just for protection against robbers. They symbolized layers of the cosmos itself, wrapping the king in a universe that would shield him until his rebirth. The burden of wealth: the greater the wealth placed in the tomb, the greater the temptation for the living to disturb it. Even during the pharaoh's life, there were whispers of those who planned to steal from these silent chambers once the entrance was sealed. To deter them, curses were inscribed on walls and sarcophagi, promises of divine punishment, blindness, or violent death to any who dared to enter. Whether or not these curses truly worked, they added an air of dread to the tomb's silence. By the time the final pieces were ready, the tomb had become more than a burial site. It was a fully furnished palace of eternity, hidden beneath the earth. But still, the most important part of the preparation remained: the pharaoh's body itself, which would have to be preserved with care, ceremony, and magic before it could make the journey. And so one must ask, in a world where decay claimed all things, how could a human body be made to last forever? Story 4. Preparing for eternity. The reign of a pharaoh began not just with a coronation, but with the first plans for his death. In ancient Egypt, rulership was as much about the afterlife as it was about the here and now. A pharaoh's tomb was not a hurried project at the end of life, but a task begun in the earliest days of rule, a silent reminder that even the living God would one day journey west into the realm of the dead. The geography of forever, the choice of burial site, was the first decision. For the early dynasties, it was the arid plateau of Saqqara. For later New Kingdom pharaohs, it was the hidden valleys of Thebes. The land had to be dry, defensible, and close enough to the Nile to allow stone and supplies to be transported, but far enough to keep thieves at bay. Here, surveyors measured the bedrock, marking where the first cuts would be made. Priests offered prayers over the ground, asking the gods to bless the work. Inscriptions on the earliest blocks might not bear the pharaoh's name. Secrecy could be a shield against those who might covet his treasures centuries before he was gone. The workforce of the afterlife, the construction of a royal tomb, was not the task of a few artisans, but an entire community. In specially built workers, villages, stonecutters, plasterers, painters, and scribes lived their lives in service to a king's eternity. They raised families, brewed beer, and told stories in the shadow of cliffs they were slowly hollowing out. Work began at sunrise, when the desert was still cool. The clang of copper chisels and the thud of wooden mallets echoed off the rock. Dust filled the air, coating skin and hair until all looked like the stone they carved. The labor was steady, deliberate, with no thought of rushing. Eternity could wait for perfect lines and smooth walls. Stone that speaks. Once the chambers began to take shape, the walls would be smoothed and prepared for painting. Here, the pharaoh's life and deeds would be recorded, not as history for the living, but as a passport for the dead. Scenes of the ruler hunting, or smiting enemies were not mere decoration. They were magic, ensuring that these acts would be repeated forever in the afterlife. Lists of offerings carved in neat hieroglyphs were spells to provide bread, beer, and linen for all eternity. The Book of the Dead, in winding lines of script, whispered instructions for the soul's journey, past demons, gates, and judgment halls. The unfinished tomb dist by years of labor. Some tombs were never completed. Death might come unexpectedly, forcing workers to rush the final stages, leaving walls half-painted or corridors rough-hewn. In other cases, political turmoil halted construction entirely, the work abandoned in silence. An unfinished tomb was not just a mark of poor fortune, but a potential disaster for the soul. Without the proper chambers and spells, the pharaoh's afterlife could be delayed, disrupted, or even denied. In the quiet, dusty tunnels, lit only by flickering oil lamps, men carved the story of a ruler who still breathed above in the sunlight. Each stroke of the chisel was a reminder. One day these halls would be sealed, the air within undisturbed for centuries, and one could not help but wonder, as the first stone was laid and the corridors slowly took shape, did the pharaoh walk these halls in his mind, already imagining the moment he would arrive here, no longer as a king, but as a traveler in the dark? The river has carried us far tonight, through birth and ceremony, through duty and preparation, through the quiet passage from life into eternity. The kings and queens of Egypt have long since turned to dust, yet their presence still lingers. In stone walls, in the worn steps of temple floors, and in the stories we tell as you drift toward sleep. Remember, history is not only found in great battles or grand empires, it is also in the steady, patient moments, the silent corridors of time, and in the lives of those who prepared each day for a future they could never truly see. Rest now with the river's whisper in your mind, and let the ancient sands cover you in peace until morning.